Hey, what's shaking, party people? I am a middle-aged guitar noob. If you were to hand me a guitar and put me in a talent show up against a 9-year-old who's been playing exactly as long as I have, that 9-year-old would whip my ass up and down the block. And then they'd film it for TikTok while doing a victory dance because 9-year-olds are vicious. Mike Dillon, shout out to Mike, writes, "Hey, if you can get to it, talk about guitar strings. As a beginner, the amount of choices kind of boggles my mind. I was just kind of curious what you and your friend thought about good standard guitar strings." Thanks, Mike. Great question. So I reached out to my guitar playing friends and asked them what kind of strings they would recommend for beginners. Their response was overwhelming. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I talk to guys who've been playing for 30, 40 years who don't especially care what brand of strings they slap on their guitars. The general gist is that unless you're chasing a particular tone like Tom chases Jerry or Pepe Le Pew chases sexual assault charges,
sit down, Daddy.
one brand of strings will work just as well as the next. In fact, some voice the opinion that it's to the beginner guitarist's advantage to try out different strings and see which ones they prefer. As your playing style develops, so will your taste in accessories. But right at the start, you might as well grab the cheapest strings you can find. That's not to say that none of the guitarists I asked recommended any brands. It seems that it's hard to go wrong with D'Addario or Ernie Ball strings. I'd add that you should try to avoid gimmicky guitar strings or strings intended for really niche playing styles. For example, jazz guitarists tend to go for flat wound strings. Let me back up a minute to explain. With your typical set of strings, the high E, B, and G strings are just plain pieces of steel wire. But the lower strings, your D, A, and low E, they have a smaller gauge wire wound around that steel wire core. Round wound strings are by far the most common for electric guitar, and they're what you'd expect from the name. The finer wire is wrapped around the core in a tight circular pattern. These strings produce a bright sound with lots of high end. Flat wound strings have the finer wire wrapped in a squared off pattern. They're much smoother to the touch and produce a warmer, smoother tone. And you may be thinking, hey, smooth is good. But much like Rob Thomas, they can sound bland and dull and don't sustain well. Let's talk about the aspect of guitar strings that matter more than the brand, the gauge. The gauge, or diameter of a wire, can impact tone, comfort, and even tuning stability. Guitar string gauges are measured in thousandths of an inch, so a 10-gauge guitar string is 10 thousandths of an inch in diameter. When you talk to guitarists about strings, they might say they play 10s or 9s or whatever. What they're describing is the diameter of their highest gauge string, usually the high E. It's just the common parlance among musicians. The next time you shop for strings at a music store, try asking for a pack of 9s. You'll feel like you're in the know. Of course, if the salesperson just points and says strings are over there, you'll probably feel like a dickhead, so maybe check to see if they keep the strings behind the counter before you ask. Now, as a rule of thumb, the range you want to look at for electric guitar strings is from 8 to 10 gauge. You take 3 packs of 9s from different brands though, and the gauges of the rest of the strings might all be different. So that's where experience and experimentation will teach you which configurations you like best. Popular wisdom dictates that the thinner the gauge, the thinner the sound, and there are guitarists out there who will cling to this assertion to their dying breath. But here's a clip from Rick Beato in which he runs a Les Paul Gibson Classic through a Marshall amp and cabinet. If you aren't familiar, this is a pretty classic rock setup. He then checks how different gauges of strings sound on the guitar while everything else stays exactly the same. Get ready for some rock science!
I'm going to play the 4 examples that I played back to back, show you what gauge of strings I'm playing so that you can hear them. 11s, 10s, 9s, 8s, and I go back to 11s.
I'm convinced. I did not expect there to be that much of a difference.
I noticed the biggest difference between the 11s and 10s right off the bat.
Yeah.
But the 9s and 8s are the best in the low end and mids, in my opinion.
For me, I like the 9s best.
Well, to me, the mids sound better on the 8s. I like the 8s.
Yeah, they're more focused, they're more direct, especially with the Les Paul humbuckers. That would sit in a track great.
I'm with you. I kind of like the 9s better because I feel like it still has the low end. You can hear, for me, I could hear the noticeable low end drop out just a little bit going to the 8s from the 9s.
But a lot of that is the control. If you haven't played 8s ever before, you don't play with the same kind of
confidence.
Yeah.
That I definitely felt that because I've never played 8s before, and I felt like I was overpowering the guitar, even with my right hand. I was like digging in too hard, and it kind of causes. It's like if you hear yourself too loud in your monitor mix or something, it causes you to tighten up and lighten.
Just be like, okay,
you're scared of it.
Once you get used to it, though, it'll.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it rings a lot better.
There's a beautiful clarity to that. To the 8s. It's amazing. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, maybe you can hear the difference and maybe you can't, but the conclusion they seem to reach is that heavier gauges aren't necessarily better. In fact, the low end on the 11s they start with sounds muddier, and that's not a quality most folks want in their guitar sound. They're split on whether they prefer the 9s or the 8s, but notice how none of these experienced guitar players are sticking with their 10s and 11s? There are other things to consider, though, when deciding which strings could be right for you. First of all, lighter gauge strings are easier on your fingers and easier to bend, but they're also easier to break and don't hold tuning that well. Heavier gauge strings are sturdy as hell and won't break or drop out of tune easily, but they can be murder on your fingers. And unless you've got some serious strength built up in those digits, you're not going to reach those full step bends. One more thing to consider is whether or not you intend to tune down from E standard. Mine might be the first generation where beginner guitarists are aware of and want to play in alternate tunings from the jump. Bands like Black Sabbath, Metallica, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Rage Against the Machine, Deftones, not to mention every single metal band from the mid-90s onward, they tune down from E to D to C to B or even lower. You can't get lighter strings to hold these low tunings because there's just not enough tension in the wire. You're welcome to try to tune a set of 8s to B, but what you're going to find is that they flap against the fretboard like an epileptic trout. So if you have your eye on covering Korn or Gojira, I'd recommend that you shop for 11s and up. For perspective, my Gretsch baritone is tuned to G. That's 5 whole steps down from E standard. So I put 13s on it. It sounds massive, but I wouldn't advise tuning that low on a guitar with a standard scale length, even with 13s. It'll put you right back in the flap zone. In conclusion, if you want to play jazz, look at flat wounds. If you want to play sludgy doom metal, pick up some 11s or 12s. For just about everything else though, a set of 8s or 9s from D'Addario or Ernie Ball or even the cheapest strings you can find, they should get you through the beginner stage. After which you'll probably have some solid ideas about what you want out of a pack of strings. Thanks for watching, y'all. If you want more midlife guitar content, please click like and subscribe. If you have a question or if there's some aspect of learning guitar that you'd like me to make a video about, drop it in the comments. And here are some videos that might be germane to your interests, so check them out. Keep trying new things, y'all. Take care.